When I was young, I remember distinctly any encounter we had with the Jewish community of the East Coast. The East Coast Jews looked down on Los Angeles as sort of backwater. Like, we weren't supposed to be here, and we were here, and as long as we were here, it was okay, but we would never be what they were. I mean, one of the most remarkable examples of this is that the university that trained me to begin my rabbinical training was called the University of Judaism. Today it's called the AJU, but then it was called University of Judaism. And the stationery of the UJ, the University of Judaism, said, University of Judaism, West Coast branch of the Jewish Theological Seminary. As if to say, you guys couldn't do this alone, right? This isn't a significant Jewish community. It's the West Coast branch of anything good in New York. And of course, our family and friends would come from New York, remember? Family and friends would visit from New York, and they'd sort of say, you know, you have no bagels here, right? You have no culture here, you have no intellectuality here. And then slowly what happened is the Jewish community of Los Angeles and of the West Coast has begun to develop. And now I think the JTS has a stationery that says it's the East Coast branch of AJU. Because what's happened is that, no, I'm serious, the intellectual gravity of the American Jewish community has shifted in this direction. And one of the most profound expressions of that, and it's an expression that you find all over Jewish history, is that a community comes of its own the day that it ordains its own rabbis. When I went to school, you could only go to the first 2 years of school here, and then you had to go to New York. Only in New York could they make you a rabbi. But the day that the Los Angeles Jewish community said, no, we're a mature community, and not just a mature community, but we have a point of view which is distinctly West Coast, a point of view which is affected by the culture here, and we began ordaining rabbis. Now, if you're going to ordain rabbis, you have to be very careful, because what you're doing is touching the Jewish future generations and generations from now. The young people that I teach at the AJU will be rabbis into the middle of the 21st century, and the children that they raise in their congregations will fill congregations, hopefully, into the 22nd century. You're talking 100 years out. So you have to choose a very extraordinary set of people to do this kind of work. And so Bradley Artson, Bradley Shavid Artson, my old friend, an old friend of this community, a dear friend of this community, in his real life, in his day job, is the human being that we entrust with the training of the leadership and the scholars who will affect Jewish life for the next 100 years. He's the dean of the Ziegler Rabbinical School, and he was chosen for that position not only because he's one of the most significant minds in the American Jewish community, but because he's one of the most significant and deep souls. And that's been the joy of sharing this community together with him for all these many years and bringing him to VBS. Tonight, we've asked him to do something which is kind of extraordinary. Usually you ask a speaker to come and speak on a topic, speak on the future of the conservative movement, or speak on the role of the synagogue in the next generation. But tonight we've asked him to speak in a personal way about the God he worships, the God he knows, the God he has discovered in his own life. And so it's a privilege to have our dear friend, Rabbi Bradley Shavid Artson.
It's a great story. It is a pleasure to be back at VBS, so thank you for turning out. I promised in honor of your coming here tonight that I'm not going to give any of the talks I've given here before. Not that any of you would remember them anyway, but I'm not going to do that. And I'm going to take this out of this. All right. You do? Oh, then it's a good thing I'm not going to repeat the talk. So I want to just say two personal things before I launch. The first thing I want to say is this is the first time I've been back here since giving a eulogy for our beloved teacher, Rabbi Schulweis. So just you should know that his influence continues to touch my heart and the students of the Ziegler School. We had a really remarkable man in our midst. And we have a remarkable man in our midst. I will tell you, no surprise, that Rabbi Feinstein is among the most beloved, terrifying, funny, inappropriate, and wise teachers that the Ziegler School offers its student. You know, and I know, there is not a finer homiletician or crafter of souls than Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and we're very grateful that he's on the faculty of the Ziegler School. Thank you for loaning him to us on occasion. So here's what I want to do tonight. I want to tell a story in 3 acts, and I want to be very personal, because I don't think you can talk about God. You're welcome. This is the good side. Michelle Obama kissed here last Hanukkah. You can't talk about God in the abstract. Everyone's encounter with God, everyone's thinking about God comes out of the sum total of their personality and their personal experiences. So I want to tell you the story about me and God. And it goes way back, and it starts Act 1 in San Francisco. I was raised in San Francisco, which, like the East Coast, despises Los Angeles. In San Francisco, we have better reasons for despising Los Angeles, but there's still a kind of de facto alliance between New York and San Francisco in which each pretend that the other have much more in common than they do with the Southland. When I told my mother that I was going to be a rabbi in Southern California, she said, Palo Alto is lovely. So, like many good people in San Francisco, I grew up a devout atheist. That is to say, growing up, I knew there was no God, and I knew that religion was for stupid people, and that it produced rigidity and self-righteousness and judgment and cruelty. By the way, there is a lot of evidence to support those conclusions, right? But I grew up despising religion. And San Francisco happens to be a wonderful place to grow up as an atheist. There's lots to do if you're an atheist in San Francisco. And so I had a very happy childhood and went to school on the East Coast, and there suffered a crisis of faith. The crisis of faith was that I had, I'm jumping ahead, that's Act 2. Act 1. So here's what happens. At age 12 and a half, I start to develop symptoms of what was ultimately diagnosed as a cancer. And I didn't tell anyone for 2.5 years, which, by the way, is not a good thing to do in retrospect, but I was mortified by the symptoms of the illness, and so I didn't share it with my parents or with anybody for 2.5 years. It was extremely painful. It pretty much consumed me, but I kept it quiet until I couldn't any longer. I was rushed to a proctologist's office, and that's all the last biological thing I'm going to tell you. And on anyone who's been to that office, you know the furniture they have that has no resale value whatsoever. I will never lie to you. So there I am, spread out on the proctologist's chair, and mind you now, I'm a 14-year-old boy, and in incredible pain and terrified, and an atheist. And he did whatever he did to me for about 2 hours, and in the middle of those 2 hours, I suddenly saw myself standing in the midst of the dry sea, with walls of water on either side, and with the children of Israel, I was walking through to freedom. I saw it with my eyes. And when the medical procedures were done, they rushed me to the hospital, and there they spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what was wrong with me, and they found out what kind of a cancer it was, and I had a combination of chemo and radiotherapy, and I forgot about my vision. because I was an atheist. I had nowhere to put it. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know how to handle it, so it disappeared. And it disappeared. That's scene one of the story. The cancer was beaten back. It came back again my junior and senior year in high school. It was beaten back again. I went off to college on the East Coast, a lovely little university located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The weather is not good. And at Harvard, I was clearly ready for love, which is what I attribute my conversionary experience to. I was a sophomore at the university. My best friends were two fundamentalist Christians, some of the finest people I have ever known to this day, some of the finest people I've ever known. I knew I couldn't buy the story that they bought, but they got me interested in thinking about religion. So I went to talk to the rabbi of Harvard Hillel, a Rabbi Ben Zion Gold, who was an extraordinary man, Holocaust survivor, lost his entire family in the Shoah, came to America, managed to get a rabbinic ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was idiosyncratic and strongly opinionated and absolutely wonderful. And I went to see him, and I said to him, I have always been an atheist. I have never doubted my atheism. I want to think about God. And he said, there is no neutral place to think about God from. You have to try being a believer and see if that works for you. And he said, to do that, I want to propose two things. He gave me a book to read by a German Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig. And he got me to agree to go to the Hillel worship study service for 2 months every Shabbat. He said, less than 2 months, you'll spend your whole time worrying, should I be standing, sitting, what's the melody, what page are we on, who is that, right? So you got to come for 2 months, and then you can figure out if it's working for you or not. So I started reading the Rosenzweig book. Rosenzweig grew up, like me, in a very assimilated liberal Jewish household. He, unlike me, decided he was going to find real religion by becoming Christian. And he wanted to become Christian the way Jesus had, so he told his mother that what he was going to do was go to Shul for Kol Nidre, at her big, ornate, Reform temple, where, frankly, they played the kind of organ music God wants you to hear on the high holidays. And I'm the last living person who thinks that. There may be one other in the room, but we are a dying breed. And he told his mother he was going to go with her to the temple for Kol Nidre, and then the next morning he would be baptized. And in a moment of unbelievable religious courage, old Mom Rosenzweig stood by the door of the temple in all of her high holiday finery, and she wouldn't let him enter the building. She blocked the door. Can you imagine how annoyed he was at his mother? Right? It's like Portnoy's complaint in German. So he's wandering the streets of Frankfurt, not able to get into the city, into his temple to have his great Jewish moment before converting, and he stumbles into a little Hasidic shtibel. He had never seen people cry when they pray. He had never seen people pray with the book closed. He had never seen people pray from their hearts. He was so moved by that evening that he never went ahead and converted. In fact, he created a program of Jewish learning, which is the great-granddaddy of this program of Jewish learning. Remarkable man. I was hooked. I fell in love. I fell in love with God. I started going to this service that was unlike any service I had grown up with. It was really a service, my mother is convinced, that was designed to trap decent atheists and twist them into becoming believers. And the way they did that was everything was sung. There was no organ, there were no instruments, everything was sung, it was all in Hebrew. And then instead of the rabbi giving a sermon, a different congregant would lead a conversation. But it was Harvard, so the congregants were people like Professor Michael Walzer, who was the chair of the political science department, and Professor Hilary Putnam, who was the chairman of the philosophy department, and Professor Ben Schwartz from Chinese studies, and Alan Dershowitz, who you know, right? And so these people would start yelling at each other about the Parsha, referring to their own scholarship to show that the other person was misunderstanding the Torah. You couldn't possibly worry that religion would make you stupid if you were in that room. And it was emotionally compelling. Now, I talk about it as I fell in love because that same semester that I met God, I met Ilana, who 32 years later is still my wife. So 32 years later, I'm with the same woman and the same God, and we've all had our ups and downs, but we're doing fine, thank you very much. And I want to say it in that way because, to me, prior to any thinking about God has to be encountering God, has to be experiencing God. And then you use your ideas to understand what you've experienced. But in the same way that when you look across a crowded room and your eyes meet and your heart leaps into your throat, the first thing you're aware of is the feelings. And then you think about it afterwards. That, by the way, gets people into a lot of trouble, right? But the thinking, what does it mean, can only happen after the encounter. And so here's what I want to say. The encounter with God happens all the time. If you open yourself to recognizing it. When I was a little kid, the women's movement was just starting, and my mother was very active in early feminist stuff in San Francisco, and they would go to what they called consciousness-raising meetings. Consciousness raising is not about teaching people what they don't already know. It's getting them to acknowledge what they already know, but they didn't let themselves see, right? So you look at that television advertisement of this incredibly happy, svelte housewife who just loves waxing her kitchen floor. And she's singing and dancing and waxing, and then you point out she is in fact an actress. And she is being paid to wax the floor. What she loves is getting paid for her work. Consciousness raising is about labeling what you already know. So if God is God, and I think God is, then the challenge is not to find our way to God. The challenge is to be able to label the God experiences we've already had, to be able to know to whom it may concern. All right, now to update a little bit, third act. Third act is, so I decided to have a career in politics. I was well on my way to being the next senator from California, so to speak, in my own head at least. I was back in California. I was a legislative aide to the Speaker of the California State Assembly, Willie Brown. I'm telling you, it was impressive. And Willie, by the way, was a great boss to work for, fabulous boss to work for. But my parents had been through a terrible divorce. They separated when I was 9. They divorced when I was 16. They fought in court the entire time. It was hideous. And I always promised myself that my family would come first before my job. By the way, rabbis choke when I say that in public. My family would come first. Once I realized that I could not be a politician and spend time with my family the way I wanted to, that in fact in the 2 years that I worked for Mr. Brown, I wasn't able to make a single new friend because I had to assume people were using me, and so I needed to use them better than they used me. And I realized, like, okay, I'm going to be 19 and never make a friend for the rest of my life. That's not a really good idea. So I didn't know what else to do, but then I was living with my girlfriend at the time, Ilana, and Ilana said to me, You've always said that when you retire from the Senate someday, you would go to rabbinical school for the learning. If that's what you want to do, you should not postpone it. You should do it now. Ilana, like many of her kind, is always right. I will tell you, ladies, it's not an attractive trait. But, guys, it's a fact. So she is right. So I trotted off to rabbinical school, and they accommodated me more or less. I accommodated them more or less. We made it work somehow. And then I came out to Mission Viejo to be a pulpit rabbi and to change the Jewish world. And we had a great run. I was there for 10 years, 5 of the happiest years of my life. The place went from 200 families to 600 families. We were a hopping, happening, exciting world center of Torah, alas, no longer in existence. And then something happened to put a bump in the road. And that is we had twins, and my son Jacob was diagnosed as severely autistic. That's Act 3. And I want to tell you something about the way most American liberals think about God. Most American Jewish liberals think about God pretty much the way their Orthodox friends think about God, except he's softer around the edges. So he's more or less all-knowing, all-powerful, except when he's not, and he overlooks our peccadillos more than the Orthodox God does. But that's pretty much what American Jews think about God, and they also think they don't believe in God, for good reason. So I had pretty much bought that story, and then I have an autistic son. And here's the dilemma that posed to me. A God who is in control of the universe is a God who either, you can take your pick, gave my son autism, or could have prevented his autism but chose not to. Those are your choices. Such a God is a moral monstrosity. I couldn't serve that God. Now, I was a congregational rabbi. I decided that the best thing to do was simply to stop talking to God. So for 2 years, I didn't talk to God and I didn't talk about God. Turns out, being a pulpit rabbi is the perfect place. Nobody noticed. Maybe that's because the chairs were so comfortable. And then one day, I remember I was in Jerusalem walking down the street, and I remember looking up at the sky, and I realized the bully was gone. I didn't believe in a God in the sky who was in control. I didn't. And I remember saying to myself, I will never lie again. I will never say something religious that I don't believe. I don't care who tells me I should say it or I have to say it. I won't say what I don't think. And to try to further my insights about this God who's not a bully, I enrolled in a doctoral program at Hebrew Union College with Dr. David Ellenson. And I spent 7 years reading biology, evolution, reading neurobiology and cognitive science, reading quantum physics and relativity, looking at how we can re-understand science to give us an accurate take on the world and then bring that back to religion. And I invented what I call process theology. Of course, then I started to read about it, and I discovered that there was this guy, Alfred North Whitehead, who had discovered it 100 years prior to me, but he just didn't get a lot of good PR. And I realized that there's a better way to understand the world, which also then is a better way to understand us and God. And the short answer for it is that God isn't all-powerful. That we and God are not solid things that move through time and bump into each other. We are ongoing events. and we are recreated at each moment, and our future is free, and that God wants us to be free, which means God not only can't, but does not change our future. We have to do that. And the way God works with us is not with coercive power, by forcing our hand, but by inspiring us to make good choices. I'll tell you an image that I've used before. This you may have heard from a previous talk. Several years ago, I got a new car. Cars have changed a lot in the past decade and a half. One of the ways that they've changed is that there's now a woman who lives behind the map in the dashboard. Right? It's my mother, the car, come back to life. So, when you're driving, you tell her, I call her Glynis because of her accent. I think she's probably from Rhodesia. I say, Glynis, here's where I want to go. I type in the address, and then she says to me, go this way. Because she knows the optimal way to get to my desired destination. Now, most of the time, I listen to Glynis. She says, take a right at the corner. I take a right at the corner. But every now and then, I don't listen to Glynis because sometimes I think I know better than she does. Sometimes she's not paying attention and they move the road. Sometimes I'm thinking about something annoying that happened at work, or I'm hungry, or I'm whatever, and I miss the turn. Fine, sue me. In that case, she does not respond like the conventional understanding of God. You have violated my instructions, and therefore you are doomed to drive the streets of LA forever. No, she says, recalculating. And then she tells me, the way you just chose to go is now permanently part of your journey. But your goal is still your goal. And so now, having integrated that into your journey, here's the optimal way to get to your goal from where you are now. That is exactly how I believe God works with everything in creation. With us, with the animals, with the plants, with the rocks, with the stars, with everything, inviting us all to make optimal choices and empowering us to know what that best choice is. And the optimal choice, which process people call the lure, L-U-R-E, is optimal in terms of justice, experience, love, compassion. It means because we are events that are constantly recreated, we are not solid substances banging on the outside of each other, that the only really effective kind of force in the world is persuasive force, not coercive. It means that no one needs to tell you what the optimal next choice is. You already know it. Because God isn't up there, out there. We and everything is marinating in God. We are swimming in God. Think of a pitcher of ice cubes and water. The water doesn't have to go to the ice cubes. The ice cubes are surrounded by water. In fact, there's water all the way through. That's what I believe is true of God, that the universe is permeated by the divine, and that God is always at every instant holding out to us the best possible next choice given the sum total of our history and our personalities. That means that some choices are now closed to me. I will never be a rock star. Alas. But it does mean that when I want to figure out what I should be doing next, what I need to do is listen carefully to what I already know. And that's how, as a rabbi, I counsel people. I don't try to tell them what they should do. I know that God has already implanted that in them. So my job is to help them not be distracted by the other voices shouting at them. Voices of self-disgust, voices of you're too old, you're too stupid, you're too fat, you're too thin, you're too whatever you're too, that people have been telling you your whole lives, and you've been telling yourself, that if I can help you to not listen to those distractions anymore, that you will then be able to hear the lure, and you will then know what to do. And I want to bring that home to Judaism in the following way. We believe that God's revelation is not closed. In other words, God gave an oral Torah, but then God gave a written Torah, and then God gives an oral Torah that helps us to know what the Torah means for us today. And that oral Torah never ends, which means we have the right to read the Torah and see things that our ancestors never saw. And that doesn't mean, well, they never saw that, so that's not Torah. No. That's not Judaism. Judaism is what a community reads as in the Torah is what God wants that community to see in the Torah. That is the living voice of God. And it is not coercive, it is persuasive. That means for us the Torah is about wisdom. Okay. I want to share one last story, and then we can, I guess, move on to some conversation. Some of you have met my son, Jacob. Jacob spent many happy hours in this very place, so thank you again to VBS for all of those years. Jacob's very smart. He is very motorically challenged. Right? So if you look at him, he would look like he's not paying attention, but he's published essays. He's given talks. Right? Someone has to read them to the room, and then he can type his answers to questions, but he's got what to say. Years ago, Jacob listened to me giving a talk on process theology, and he's able to hear through walls, as many autistic kids are. By the way, that's not a trait you want in people you live with. Right? It's a little bit like living with the KGB. But I was giving a talk, and Jacob was up the hill at Camp Ramah, and as I started to finish the talk, I saw him get up from the Chader Ochel and start walking up to the Beit Knesset, and he opened the door as I'm wrapping up in my, oratorical whatever rabbinic thing, and he takes his keyboard to type, and he types Abba. If what you're saying is true, then God didn't make me autistic. And I said, that is right, Jacob. I don't believe God made you autistic. I don't believe in a God who does that. And he said, but God is working with me so that I can overcome my autism. And I said, that's exactly right. God never gives up on you, and so you should never give up either. And Jacob said, I need to go outside and listen for the lure. And he walked outside. When I give this talk at synagogues around the country, people start to cry, and they say, I've always thought this, I didn't know I was allowed to. Everywhere, by the way, except for VBS, where Rabbi Schulweis and Rabbi Feinstein have been giving a message a lot like this for decades. Okay, so this summer, I had a cousin, an Israeli cousin, one of my nephews, Alana's nephew, who is in Israel. He wants to go to college. He needs to improve his English. So, of course, what does he do? He calls up his American cousin, the rabbi, and says, get me a position at Camp Ramah so I can practice English. So I do. I get him a position at Camp Ramah. He's on the Mishlachat. He's working with the Israeli staff. But being that he's a good Israeli, he has a pair of tefillin, and he has no idea what to do with them. So we spend literally 2 hours in my study with me trying to show him how to put on the tefillin and stop the tefillin from trying to strangle him. Honest to God, it was like a comedy sketch. Every time he kept putting on the tefillin, they would attack him, and I would have to peel them off. But after about an hour of this torturous event, Jacob came over and he took his buddy board, which is the keyboard that he types with, and he typed to his cousin, Ro'i, you're lucky. You can put on tefillin, I can't. And my heart breaks. I say, Jacob, I want to tell you something about how this works. You're only responsible for the mitzvot you can do. And if you can't do it, then it's not a sin if you don't do it. But I said, but it goes beyond that. A mitzvah that you intend to do, but you're not able to do, it counts. And so in God's eyes, you have been putting on tefillin every day since your bar mitzvah. But here's what we're going to do from now on. In the morning, when I put on my talis and tefillin, we're going to do it together, and it's going to count for both of us. So here's how I start my day. When Jacob's up and I'm up, we go downstairs into my study, I take my talis, and I wrap it around both of us. And then Jacob says the bracha, and I say amen. And then Jacob takes my tefillin out of my bag, and he unwraps it and he hands it to me. And as I wrap it around my arm, he says the first blessing. And I say, amen. Then I put it around my head, and he says the blessing, and I say, amen. And then he sings, Oseh Shalom, and V'nomar Lefanav, and a medley of synagogue hits, and I say, amen. That's God, ladies and gentlemen. That is this extraordinary persuasive force that won't give up on my son. And for years, Jacob has been self-surpassing in exactly the way that I believe God is self-surpassing. Always absorbing what is new and always inviting creation to make the next optimal choice. And I feel God's presence at those moments. I would imagine if we sat here quietly for a minute, you could think of the moments that you have felt that presence too. It's not, says the Bible, found in the thunder and the lightning. God isn't gaudy and God isn't dramatic. It's in the still, small voice that whispers to us, you can do it. You can do it. Don't give up. You can do it. And that's where I find God. Thank you.
I know that we have lots and lots of questions to ask Rabbi Artson because he's presented us with not only a very beautiful and personal vision of God, understanding of God, but a challenging understanding of God because like most of us, the understanding of God that he's offered is not the one that we grew up with. And when someone tells you that the God you grew up with is not the God I believe in, but I have a very different idea, it sort of shakes you a little bit. So let's go back and pick up a few of the ideas and try to contrast them with what we might call a conventional idea of God, and also ask you to apply that idea of God, the new one that you've discussed with us, to some of the bigger questions of religious life. Let's go back to I think the one of the most important concepts in the conversation is this idea of the lure, L-U-R-E. So tell us again what that is, what it feels like, what you're trying to describe using that idea.
Right. It's admittedly a clunky word. I keep trying to figure out a better word. I just don't know it. So the conviction that you have an intuitive sense of what you should do next, and you don't need to be told what that is. So I have actually the perfect autobiographical story of the lure. I'm 17 years old. I want to go out with my friends. It's Friday night. And my mother says to me, your grandmother called and she'd like you to visit. I say, but I want to go see my friends. My mother, who didn't know she was practicing process theology, she doesn't say, I'm telling you, you must go see your grandmother. She does something much worse than that. She says, no, she doesn't use guilt. She says, You know, I know you will do the right thing. That's the lure. The lure is you know what the right choice is. And it turns out, paradoxically, the best way to not follow the lure is to have someone order you to do it. Because the natural response to being mandated to do something is to say, I'm not going to do it. My mother knew that, so all she said was, I'm not going to tell you what to do, you'll do the right thing. Which meant that, of course, I found myself driving to San Mateo to see my grandmother on a Friday night. That's the lure. And the claim is, because we're not really separate, disconnected entities, we're really, all of us, part of an ongoing process that connects us to everything. God isn't outside of us. God permeates everything, and so you have an immediate, intuitive understanding of what you could optimally be doing next. And there are other voices that are shouting at you at the same time. But if you sit quietly and you say, what do I know should I be doing next? You'll come up with the right answer. You will, and that's the lure. All right, let me give you an example of that. Ma Adonai shoel mi'imach, the book of Deuteronomy asks, what does God ask of you? And then it proceeds to give a fairly lengthy answer. I love the fact that the Torah phrases it as a question. God is coming to respect us in our dignity by saying, here's what I want from you. Here's what I ask of you. You can rise to this. And that is in some ways different than some of the things we've been told about God. But here's what I want us to have an honest conversation. The God you were told to believe in, you don't believe in. So it shouldn't be shocking when someone comes in with a better vision. Right? I'm trying to give you a God you actually do believe in, which is a universe in which, if we all do our best, we can nudge the universe in a good direction. A universe that is about our taking care of each other and honoring each other and seeing each other in our concrete individuality. Not as some larger entity, but each of us distinct and irreplaceable, and to be met in our individuality and in our uniqueness. That really is the lure.
So I want to push this a little bit. And I have two distinct kinds of questions from this. Number one, not all of us have a distinct intuitive understanding of what to do next. Number one, sometimes I'm torn between two things, either both of which are important, or neither of which are particularly good, and I don't know how to make this decision. And number two, I know a lot of people whose intuitive understanding is perverse, is simply perverse, and who will act in ways which are, and will then justify it with a straight face. And I don't mean someone who's sociologically pathological, just someone who's gotten used to a certain pattern of behavior in which perverse behavior just becomes the sort of natural way that they respond to the world. So here's my question. That's only the preface. The real question is, the Torah has a very different idea, at least as I read it. The Torah in Exodus, for example, pictures God as a moral other who gives you directions. The Ten Commandments are not the 10 lures. Last time I looked, the Ten Commandments say, I know you want to go out and play football on a Friday night. I need you home with your family. So tell me, number one, how do you understand the lure in terms of the whole range of human experience? And number two, how do you square that with the Torah's fairly distinct picture of a very different kind of God?
Okay, so in Hebrew we go from right to left. So I'm going to go with the last question first.
That's fine.
You can't help but looking at the world through your spectacles. Change the spectacles and the world looks very different. So when we approach the Torah, we approach it with a preconceived notion of an all-powerful, eternal, unchanging, moral other, whatever that means. But I don't approach the Torah that way, so I don't see it that way. I note, for example, that in English we call them the Ten Commandments, but that is not what we call them in Hebrew. Right? They're the 10 words, the 10 sayings, the 10 phrases. Right? That's not insignificant. The Torah knows how to call something a commandment. Right? These are 10 words, which is, come gather around the mountain and let's talk. And in fact, the rabbis understand that so well that they compare the gathering at Mount Sinai not to a coronation, but to a marriage, in which the clouds over the mountain are our chuppah. So this is us getting married to God, and these are the words we recite to each other. You will be my people, I will be your God. You shall have no other God before me. That's kind of intimate, right? When Alana turns to me and says, you're my man, it means she needs something. But nonetheless, I find it charming. So I want us to re-look at our sources, and I want to note several things. When God commands us in the Torah goes out of its way to say it is litov lach. It is for our benefit. God isn't an arbitrary sultan who says, jump, yes sir, how high. God is one who I think is commanding us, but unless you're suddenly becoming way more frum than I've known you to be in the past.
Yeah, I didn't tell you that part, did I?
You're not listening to the lure. My understanding, and this is a Hasidic teaching, is that the only thing that the Israelites heard with their ears at the mountain was the initial aleph, which is to say the rest was internal, right? And that's what the lure is. It's the imperative. Now, don't mistake me. Just because there's not a dictator in the sky doesn't mean it's do whatever you want. We live in a universe of moral consequence. That is God's sovereignty. And God rules, which is to say, if you make bad choices, there will be bad consequences that will make it harder to make good choices later on. The door is never slammed shut, but you know as well as I do, it's better to consistently make good choices than to try to correct and change it later on. Those of you who, like me, are on a perennial diet know exactly what I'm talking about, right? So I think there is indeed a moral ecology in the universe, and our choices close doors and open doors. But we are always, always, always free to start making better choices, and given human neurological plasticity, the longer and more persistently we make good choices, the easier it becomes to make those good choices. So I think this is a view of God that is more shocking, A, to people who don't know rabbinic sources well, B, who don't come with a screen of a dominant theology in between them and those sources. So there are plenty of sources that talk about God and Moses having arguments. Have you noticed, for example, that in the Torah, God consistently rewards the people who don't listen to God? Right? The ones who do what God says, those are the schmucks who end up getting, zapped, right? But it takes an Abraham to say, you didn't make me to say yes to that. I'm going to say no to that. Right? And to Moses, who's told, stand back, I'm going to wipe these people out. And Moses says, not on my watch, you're not going to. That's a tradition, as you know, of self-determination. But Americans misunderstand self-determination for anything goes. And that, I think, is the logical response to the bad metaphysics of a dictator in the sky, right? That's the teenager saying, I'm not going to do it because you told me to, right? What I want to do is invite us back to a grown-up Judaism. which is, you know the right thing to do, and I trust you to make the right decision. Now, all of the psychopaths that you're hanging out with,
My kind of Jews.
and I just want to say that we're not supposed to discuss the Rabbinical Assembly conventions in public.
United Synagogue in this case.
I'm not going there.
You're not going?
I am.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
There's a lure to the bar at about midnight if you want to join me.
I think there are two explanations for why people persistently make self-destructive bad choices. The first is they are so wounded that they can't overcome their panic, their rage, their defensiveness, and that leads them to make self-destructive and harmful choices to others too. Mm-hmm. And the solution to that is to love them more. I am really a liberal.
Oh, you were from San Francisco. So
Thank you, I am. And,
Came by
and it is the city of love.
the honest way, right.
So the thing is, and let me give you a not a modern liberal take on that, but an ancient liberal take on that. Right? When God tells us we're chosen, the response is not, I have chosen you and therefore exult over everyone else. God says, I've chosen you, and therefore you must feed the hungry and clothe the naked and care for the sick. It takes someone who is secure enough in their love that they can go out in the world and do good in the world. So I think there are a lot of people who did not get enough love. And the solution is for us to open them to love now, because love is the most powerful transformative medicine in the world. Mm-hmm. I think that notion of a king in the sky is part of the toxin. It's what keeps them locked into their fear and their fear of punishment. And that setting them free is what will allow them to embrace God and to embrace their own moral responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Michael?
What is the difference between the lure and the lure of ethical culturalism? Why do we need a God at all? Why can't we go from being atheists and just have that lure to be God-like within ourselves and do the right thing?
Right. So the question...
Self-determination. Why do we have to bring in the whole concept of God?
Let me just repeat the question so we get it down. So the question is, what's the difference between this notion of the lure and any kind of moral intuition, in which case you don't really need a God or the language of God at all. You're living in a universe with human beings who are striving with their own consciences to do the right thing.
All right, so it is a great question. Thank you. Here's what I want to say. Not believing in a coercive God, and I don't, means I can say definitively on God's behalf that God doesn't care whether you believe or not. Right? God doesn't love you less or more. It's not ego tripping in the cosmos. So if you can make the system work without reference to some kind of universal consciousness or oneness, go ahead. I'm fine with that. There are certainly many noble moral atheists, and there are many religious jerks. There are also many atheist jerks and many noble religious people. Unfortunately, it doesn't have an ideological marker. But I will tell you, I can't tell you why we need to have God. I can tell you why I do. Right? Here's what gets added. The secular, intuitive moral positions have never, to my mind, demonstrated how they can distinguish between it's good and I like it. Everyone understand what I'm saying? right? The fact that you like certain behavior and you dislike certain other behaviors, okay, that's fine. But I don't know how you get the right to call one good and one bad and think you're saying anything other than I like this and I don't like that. All right, when you say it's good, you're saying corresponds to some standard that's bigger than just I like it or I don't like it. And that's the atheist's backhanded compliment to God. That's to say, there are moral standards, and they may get filtered through cultural lenses, but nonetheless, I'll give you one of my favorite, this is Mordecai Kaplan, by the way, right? Kaplan said, there are many cultures in the world in which people kill the elderly, but all of them have a justification for it. Nobody justifies being nice to their spouse. Right? Because you don't need a moral justification for doing the right thing. You need a moral justification to feel okay about doing the wrong thing. Right? And I think that there is, in fact, a common moral heritage that the universe points to. Those things that lead to human thriving. What Kaplan called the force that makes for salvation. Right? And that may not be a guy in the sky, but that is to say, this isn't simply a cultural preference, and this isn't a personal aesthetic choice. There are standards of good and of evil that we discover but don't create. And that to me is simply another way of saying God. That's what I mean by God. I mean that built into the structure of the universe is a non-negotiable standard of right and wrong. And that we're born with that standard, and it can be corrupted, but we're born with it, and we can return to it with a sense of familiarity. Last thing I want to say is, I've given this part of this talk here before, so I'll be very brief. A universe that for 14 billion years has been governed by the exact same laws should endlessly produce the same thing. But it doesn't. This universe governed by the exact same laws keeps producing novelty, greater relationship, greater consciousness, greater engagement, greater self-consciousness. And that to me looks like the universe being invited in a direction. That also to me is a pointer towards what I call God.
Does God have consciousness? Is there?
Yes.
So there's a someone, as it were. It's.
There are aspects of the divine that are mindful, because out of the universe, mindfulness comes. So absolutely, I think it is far more plausible to assume that a mind invited the universe into self-organizing than to assume the alternative, which frankly has never seemed plausible, which is we're in a big dead machine. And that, by the way, leads to the impossible position of neurologists and philosophers today who can't explain consciousness. Because if it's a big dead machine, we should be zombies, right? We should walk around and look like human beings but have no feelings and no awareness. I can understand how electricity pulsating through our nervous system would get us to move around and behave in a way that's self-protecting. But how it would get us to feel love and empathy and justice and kindness, no one with that conventional morality, that conventional metaphysics, has an answer for that, and they never will. So I'd rather start with the assumption that the only part of nature we know from the inside is us, and we know us from the inside as creatures of consciousness and of ethics and of mind. So I think we emerge out of mind.
So I want to go through a few topics which are apropos of Jewish life, and as you would apply this idea to Jewish life, okay? Yeah. So let's begin with prayer. So the conventional notion of prayer is I'm communicating with someone who is above me and more powerful than I am, and either placating, appealing, these kinds of things. What does prayer mean in this model?
Rabbi Feinstein, Isn't it amazing how he knows exactly what that tone means?
You said I'm good at inappropriate questions.
I cannot answer that question the way you just asked it.
Okay,
There are two things that are wrong with it.
okay.
The first was the gesture. I don't know who you're pointing at,
God.
but I don't think that's where God lives, because as you know, God is here and God is there and God is truly everywhere.
Yes, he's also Avinu Shabashamayim,
Correct,
which
but
is
that's not
up there.
okay. And I don't think that's the dominant understanding of prayer. I think that's some people's dominant understanding. And here's one of the challenges you have to deal with. It's the same challenge with studying the Tanakh with an Israeli. Right? Israelis assume that Hebrew has always meant what they mean by Hebrew. So they know what the Bible really means because they speak Hebrew. Do you know that one of the best-selling books in Israel this year is a Hebrew translation of the Torah? I love that. It's great. Right? And it was translated because Israeli kids read the Torah and it sounds to them like what Chaucer sounds like to American kids. So they translated the Torah into modern Israeli Hebrew, and it's worth reading because you see how different modern Israeli Hebrew is from ancient biblical Hebrew. Okay, so why am I raising that example? Because people assume when they say traditional Judaism that what today gets called traditional Judaism, that's always been traditional Judaism, but it wasn't, right? Art Scroll didn't exist back in the day. So let me tell you an example of traditional prayer. When Rambam prays, Rambam says that what we are to do when we pray is we are to stand with our feet together. We are to put our hands over our heart with our right hand above, and we are to look down. That's not up there. That's in here. Right? So I don't accept that the tradition thinks of an up there God. I think the tradition thinks of that as a metaphor. Right? And that there were sophisticated Jews in every age who saw God and they looked deep, not up. So what prayer is for me is multiple things that it's always been. First, it is aligning myself with the divine. I take a time 3 times a day formally and more times a day than that informally to realign myself with God. Right? When I was a kid, we used to take a magnet and you run it through the sand. Remember, and the iron filings line up? That's for me what davening is. It's aligning the iron filings of my soul with God. 2, it is using the Siddur as a script so that I become the Jew for whom these are the appropriate words. That's how I become part of Am Yisrael. And 3, prayer is about offering God my help in healing the universe. So I don't believe in a God who breaks the rules, but I do believe in a nature that is so rich and is surprising that we're barely figuring out what nature can do. And one of the things I think that is possible is because we are bundles of energy, we can lend our energy to each other. So when I pray, I don't pray with content. I pray for relatives or loved ones who are ill, and I say, God, take my energy and use it for their good. I don't know what their good is in every case. You know better than me. Use it for their good. And I think that sometimes whatever has happened is too far gone for the vector to make a difference. But sometimes, you know, if the arc is long enough and you tilt it just a little bit, you can change the outcome. And I think in that regard, our prayers count. What I'm not expecting is God to break the rules. I'm not expecting God to make exceptions. I don't think God can break the rules. But I think built into the rules, there's a whole lot of wiggle room for our goodness and our energy to change the outcome. And it also, finally, reminds me who I'm supposed to be in the world. The days that I daven, I'm a different person than the days that I don't.
What would you, how would you interpret the notion of mitzvah, of commandment? Or beyond that, of halakha, of a system, a matrix of commandments?
Great, thank you for the translation. So, it's going to be the next finger next time.
You are getting closer, that's true. The lure of the inappropriate.
We are dangerous together. So, look, in Hebrew, the root of mitzvah means, as the rabbi said, command. But the Hasidic masters understood that the Aramaic, which is the language of the Talmud, that same three-lettered root means to join or to link up with. American Jews do not believe that the mitzvahs are commanded. They don't. You don't. If you thought they were seriously the commands of the creator of the universe, you would not be living the life that you're living. But here's what you do think. You think that when you gather with your loved ones around the Shabbos table and your grandchild starts singing out the blessings for the light, you start to cry because you feel connected. That's the Aramaic mitzvah. And I'd like to honestly say that's what we mean by it. So you are the God who joins us to God, to our people, to each other through these sacred acts. And being free to make choices doesn't mean every choice is equally wise. There are better and worse choices. So choices that bring God into your life more regularly, choices that remind you of your ethical obligations, choices that link you to your Jewish heritage, those are better choices than choosing not to make those choices. So in that sense, I do believe the mitzvot are commands, but here I want to be clear, they're commands not like a speeding law is a command. They're not imposed from without. They're commands the way wanting to make my daughter happy is a command, right? Shira calls me in the middle of a busy day, and I almost always take her call, no matter what I'm doing. And I always say, is this an emergency? Do you need to talk now? And if she says I need to talk now, then pretty much anybody gets told, excuse me, I need to talk to my daughter. Right? That's what mitzvah means. Mitzvah is not based on authority, it's based on love. God says, you should love me with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Well, if you love someone with all your heart and soul and might, that will change your behavior. And if your behavior doesn't change at all, that's a sign that you don't really love. Because when you love, you behave differently. And that, for me, is what the mitzvot are.
So continue on that vein. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might. What does that mean in terms of process theology? Louise, could you do me a favor? You see that white knob on the wall? The lure asks me to give it a turn to the right. Just turn it one half turn to the right. Keep going, keep going. Perfect. That's fine. Thank you.
That feels good.
Yeah, wait.
So, ask the question again.
What am I loving when I love the Lord God with all my heart and soul and might?
Great. So, if I could, in the house that Harold built, the mistake that Kaplan made, to my mind, and therefore that the master inherited, was a bad metaphysical system. Kaplan accepted that the universe was a dead machine. He accepted, along with the pragmatists, that things that you speculate about, you shouldn't talk about. So he was a keen intellect. He was a passionate moral man. I'm not in any way faulting him for the deep Jewish feelings, but his metaphysics held back his system. Mm-hmm. So what Kaplan had to do is say either God is a big guy in the sky, or he's a collection of natural forces that we lump together. Mm-hmm. He was forced by his metaphysics to make that choice, but I'm not. Because what Whitehead points out is that there are no things in the universe. There are events. And events are recurrent patterns, some of them over time and some of them instantaneous. So an event can be particles and a wave at the same time. Mm-hmm. You can be both. So in some regards, God is a what, and in some regards, God is a who. And I don't have to choose between them. So I sometimes find it helpful to think of God in terms of what. And there are occasions where that's the best metaphor to connect with the divine. But don't let your metaphors harden into prose, right? They're still a metaphor. So there are more often than not times where thinking of God as a who is better for our relationship. But I'm not making God unique in that regard. There are aspects of each of us that are what, and there are aspects of each of us that are who. And when we talk about Valley Beth Shalom, there are ways in which Valley Beth Shalom is what, and there are ways in which Valley Beth Shalom is who, right? We don't have to choose between them. So God is that oneness, mindfulness, empowering source, companion that encourages me to be better than I was, and who empowers me to be better than I was. And loving God, in that regard, I really am a simple Jew, means love. It means love. It means gratitude. It means that I am overwhelmingly grateful. Mm-hmm. Can I give you a wacky theological example not heard in a synagogue since Sadia Gaon, 9th century Baghdad? I learned Modeh Ani from Molly. Molly is a mutt that I picked up at the shelter. Here's how Molly wakes up in the morning. My alarm goes off, and she looks with the corner of her eye, but she doesn't move her head because she sleeps very soundly because she lives life hard, right? But as I start to get out of the bed, the tip of her tail starts to tap the bed. And by the time I stand up, she's still lying with her eyes closed, but her tail is wagging, right? And she reminds me to say Modeh Ani. Gosh, it's great to wake up. It's great to be alive. Look who I get to be with today. Look at all the things I get to do. She reminds me of that. That's something to turn to and to say, thanks, this is going to be a great day. I'm alive, I'm awake, there are people I love, there are things that I get to do. Thank you, God.
All right, one more, and then I want to let you ask some questions. So, given this idea of God, okay, how do you interpret the notion of Jewish peoplehood and the uniqueness of Jewish culture? How do you understand chosen people? How do you understand, is there a collective aspect to the lure that gives us something called Torah?
Yes.
What is Jewish peoplehood in this concept?
So, look, the notion of lure is that God is constantly addressing every level of creation and inviting every level of creation to make the optimal choice. So you yourself are not a single solitary individual. You are a colony of colonies. We've talked about that here before. I'll just remind you, right, that you have outsourced many of the biological functions of your body, and about a third of the cells in your body are not primate cells. You find that out when you take antibiotics, right? Because then you kill many of those non-primate cells, and then you have to take probiotics because you start shutting down, right? So you're not a single entity. You are a trillion cells working in harmony together. And I'm not a single entity because by now my parents have pruned my brain so that my brain is unique. I carry my mother and father every waking moment, right? And by now I've lived with Alana long enough that she's pruned it's a miracle there's anything left. And she's pruned my brain too, as have my children, as have the people I make part of my life. We're not separate individuals. So I think a part of my identity by now is my Jewishness. But Jewishness isn't something I have alone. It's something that we've all been working on together. And by we, I mean you in this room, and Jews I've never met, and Jews who've been long dead, and Jews not yet born. We're all shaping this thing together. And absolutely, I believe that God addresses us as a people and invites us to make good choices. We're doing a terrible job of that, but God is always inviting us to make better choices as a people. And so for me, chosenness, and now I want to say, in process theology, the only things that are really real are not abstract ideas. They are entities over time, events over time. So it is true the Jewish people are unique, but so is everybody unique. And everyone is uniquely unique, which means Jews are unique, different than the way Ethiopians are unique, or than the way Mexicans are unique, or even Canadians are unique, right? And so there are traits about the Jews that are breathtaking. Let me just mention a couple. One, if you recognize that there are as many Jews today as there are Dutch Amish, which is true, and then you look at how many Dutch Amish have won Nobel Prizes, Pulitzer Prizes, invented new industries, created new countries, it is mind-boggling the footprint we have in the world, right? Our mutual friend David Wolpe pointed out to me years ago that it should astonish you that 1/4 of humanity is Chinese. 1/4 of humanity, and we don't have a word for a person who isn't Chinese. 0.003% of humanity is Jewish, and they have a word for someone who's not Jewish. How wacky is that? Right? So I think there is a reality to our having been chosen. That, again, was a mistake that Kaplan made.
Israel is the size of Connecticut, but for Israelis, every place else is chutz la'aretz.
Correct.
Which means outside of Israel.
And,
right? Yes.
but what's amazing is how much the world goes along with that. Look at how much attention the world pays to Israel. Look at the disproportionate level of criticism that Israel pays. That's anti-Semites' compliment to Jewish chosenness, right? Everyone expects us to behave differently than they do, right? So when they butcher each other, that's no big deal. And when we do something they don't like, that becomes huge, right? There's a kind of weird craziness to it, except that it makes sense, given our history. We are distinctively the people who have wed ourselves to ethical monotheism. And while other people were coming up with cuisine or literature or building buildings or doing whatever it is, most people conquering each other, butchering each other, whatever they were doing, we were telling the world that if you don't care about the poor, then your service of the divine is an offense. That's amazing and counterintuitive. We were telling the world that human dignity is not something earned, it's something that you're born into. We told the world that everybody gets a day off and that that's part of your God-given heritage. We've changed the world in ways way out of proportion to us at any point in our history, and it shows no signs of slacking. So I'm a big believer in Jewish chosenness. I just don't think it was imposed from without. I think it bubbles up from within.
So you've all been chosen. We have some questions that we can ask the rabbi. Louise has the microphone, and she's going to carry it around. Please.
What's the difference between this acting correctly comes from within because of God, from what neuroscience is telling us, that if we do something that we like you wake up and you see your dog and you feel love for it, well, you develop that, and so when you see your dog, I don't know the details, the brain secretes more serotonin or it drops down, and whatever increases a specific is responsible for feeling good. Just other things feel bad. And they don't know completely what the next step is. What does the serotonin do, or lack of it do? And they don't have the whole pathway, but it's a big step towards connecting our feelings with what's going on in our brain. And it seems to me to be
So
leaving.
the question is this. Let me rephrase the question. The question is, Brad, on the day that neuroscience completely figures out the biochemistry of love or the biochemistry of happiness, is that going to compromise your idea of the lure and how it draws us to making optimal choices?
It will never happen. It will never happen. Neurologists will never fully explain love. Let me tell you why not. Let's imagine a physicist who says everything in the world is matter in motion, right? And there's nothing else. Matter organizes itself into chemicals, that we call chemistry. But there's nothing additional to it, it's just a higher level of organization. And then chemistry organizes itself into self-sustaining systems, that we call biology, that's life. But there's nothing additional. It all boils down to matter in motion. Will you ever understand Beethoven's Ninth in terms of electron vibrations? No. Here's why not. Because you can only explain something on the level of the phenomenon itself. No biologist can explain biology in terms of chemistry. No chemist can explain chemistry in terms of physics. And no psychologist can explain psychology in terms of biology. Because each level of organization requires its own level of explanation, which is why neurologists will never be able to say why you chose that one and not that other one, and will never be able to get you why serotonin feels that way when you're in the room with that one, because it's a different level of organization. And because of that, our freedom is secure. You will never be reduced to a biochemical reaction. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't grow out of the biology, that grows out of the chemistry, that grows out of the physics. I'm a naturalist. In that regard, Mordechai Kaplan, Harold Schulweis, and I agree completely. The place where we differ is their notion of nature was impoverished. They saw nature as a machine, and I see nature as way more like an organism. Nature is constantly surprising us. Can I share with you the latest nature surprise?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is cool and gross.
It's late. Go ahead.
So I read an article about the dung beetle. Everybody knows what a dung beetle is, right? It's a beetle that feeds on things that you don't think of as food, right? Now here's what they found out. Dung beetles roll the dung into a ball and then they roll it in a straight line to where they want to take it. So the question was, how do these beetles figure out what a straight line is? They're, after all, beetles. And they did an experiment and they discovered that dung beetles use the star to navigate the dung. They put them in a room where it was black and they had lights on the ceiling. The dung beetles could roll the dung in a straight line. When they turned the lights off, they started walking randomly and they couldn't move the dung. That means there's a level of mindfulness in beetles that is watching the heavens and making decisions. Like, nature is so much more marvelous than we have known, and we keep discovering mindfulness further down than we knew. So that's how it, I hope that in some ways Kaplan and Schulweis are wrong about an afterlife, because I'm looking forward to a good long conversation in which I want to say, you made false dichotomies that made you make choices that were moral choices, right? You chose always the righteous path, so kudos for you. Righteousness is more important than metaphysics, I'll give you that. But with a better metaphysics, you would have been able to accommodate much richer choices. Love can only be understood on the level of love. It will never be boiled down.
For the record, I think it's a proper understanding of Kaplan,
But not Schulweis.
but not Schulweis. And I'll give just the footnote is, you can't blame Kaplan because Kaplan was educated before relativity physics was published. I mean, the man lived before 1925. What you're talking about, Whitehead is a direct result of relativity physics, of Einstein. Kaplan is still living in a Newtonian world. Schulweis's move, and Noah will correct me if I'm wrong, Schulweis's move was simply to put metaphysics on the shelf altogether.
Correct.
He just said, you can't talk about metaphysics. And whenever I asked him about that, he just said, Maimonides said you can't talk about metaphysics, and neither can I.
Okay, and I'll say two things in defense of Kaplan and of Schulweis.
Yeah, okay.
The older Kaplan was very Whiteheadian. Right? He refers to Whitehead, he quotes Whitehead, he talks about supranaturalism.
Did he understand Whitehead, though?
I think he may be the last one who did.
I'm not
Maybe
sure.
not, but in any case, and Schulweis, when he and I would have lunch and we would talk
Yeah.
process,
Right.
he wrote a very generous blurb on the back of my book, and he often spoke about it as the metaphysics that made his
Yeah,
agenda
godliness. Right.
of godliness coherent.
Right.
So I think that's right. Fair enough.
Okay. Who has the mic? Bob, go ahead.
What is the role of God in one's lure? Can I say the hand of God guided me?
Can you say that you just did? And you said it nicely, too. Yes, of course you can, because I do think that God is, at every instant, giving us an intuitive awareness of the optimal choice and empowering us to make that choice, but not forcing us to make the choice. You still have the freedom to make the wrong choice if you choose.
Now, if you look backwards, can you say it was Beshert?
If that's what you mean by Beshert.
Beshert means I made the optimal choice despite myself.
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
All right, so you're right. Okay. David?
Okay, hi. Yes, okay, so I'm a Palestinian kid, and I'm raised, or my God tells me, or I'm to believe based on my God, that all Jews are dirt and pigs and should be killed. And I'm a little bit older, and my parents put a knife in my hand, and I say, I don't know if I'm ready for this. I want to go play with my friends. And my parents say, I'm sure you'll do the right thing, that God will guide you. So how does lure and God play into that scenario?
I want to broaden that before I answer that. You're a Jewish kid who's been taught that you have a monopoly on our land and that they have souls of animals, and that only Jews have human souls. And you're a Palestinian kid who's been taught that the Jews are dirty and that they've invaded your land. How do you combat education of hatred? That's really the question. So the answer on both sides is the same. The last people who will fall in line are the politicians. What we need to start doing in good process form is hearing each other's stories. I'll give you two for instances. There's an organization of Palestinian and Israeli parents whose children have been killed in the struggle. They don't have a political agenda. They don't have a solution. All they do is a Palestinian and an Israeli tell their story. And they tell it together in the same room. Right? The shul that I go to has invited such parents. It's astonishing. You watch this Israeli mother got up and talked about her son being killed by a Palestinian terrorist. Then a Palestinian man talked about his 10-year-old daughter killed by an Israeli sniper. Right? And all of a sudden, you can't stereotype them the same way you did before. There was a man who came to speak at the synagogue I attend named Ali Abu Awad. I highly recommend you bring him here at some point. He is the Palestinian Gandhi. Right? So this is a guy whose mother served in Arafat's cabinet. His brother was killed by an Israeli soldier. He served 5 years in an Israeli prison. And in Israeli prison, he took out of the library Anne Frank's diary. And he was blown away. It had never occurred to him that Jews could be victims. Just hadn't occurred to him. He had never seen it. And then it got him thinking, and it made him realize they're not going away, they Israelis, and we're not going away. So we had better start talking to each other. So he's created an organization. Again, they don't have a political recommendation. All they want to do is listen to each other. And so they routinely get Israelis and Palestinians together to speak their own story. I am convinced, in good process form, that it is the concrete reality of the individual human that will create a groundswell to turn the hate around, if anything will. It may not. It's easy to fall back on hate and fear, but it's gotten us nothing but more hate and fear, and eventually we are going to have to turn it away from the politicians, and we are going to have to start listening to each other's stories and then allow that to modify our choices. It's the only solution at hand.
Who has the mic, please?
Yes, when you read the last few parshas in Deuteronomy, how do you reconcile your thought of the lure versus all the admonitions that God renders if you don't follow my commandments?
Yes. Okay. So can we just have a time out here and a moment of actual honesty? How many of you believe God dictated the words of the Torah as we have them? Every word in the Torah was verbally spoken by God. Oh,
It's
okay.
unanimous.
So then let's stop pretending that that's what we think, okay? Could we just do that for a moment? Could we say that the Torah is the work of the Israelite people who listened with their inner heart and they wove together across the centuries what distilled into stories we tell each other to encounter God and words that we put into the literary character God because we hear God when we hear those words? So if what you're asking me is what do I do with the last few parshiot, A, neither I nor I think you think that someone in the sky barked those words to us. I don't believe that. I believe that God is heard by listening quietly and then pouring that into words. And the miracle of the Torah is it is, to my knowledge, the only book that was written by an entire people working together, listening for the divine lure. So what do those curses and blessings mean? That's easy. If you keep making bad choices, your life will become harder and harder and harder, and your options will grow fewer and fewer and fewer. And if you make good choices, then you will find the world will open its bounty to you. I think that is literally true. Let me give you some examples. We Southern Californians continue to drive our cars all by ourselves, and our cars are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Are you enjoying the freeways these days? I'm not. That's not God punishing us. That's God pointing out, if you live a life of mitzvot, then the rain will fall, the cattle will wax fat, things will go well with you. And if you make selfish, greedy, short-sighted choices, then don't be surprised when the polar ice caps melt. That's not God stepping in. The Torah is pointing out, and that's, by the way, how Moses tells us. Moses says, sing this song so that when you are a people in your own land, when you can determine your own future, you will remember that there are consequences to the choices that you make. And that will remind you to make good choices. I think we have turned that into a parody of what it was intended to be. It's not about external punishment. Mitzvah goreret mitzvah, avera goreret avera. The outcome of a mitzvah is another mitzvah, not something like, oh, you win a prize. right? When you are loving to your spouse, no surprise, almost all the time, your spouse is more loving to you back, right? That's just the reality of the way the universe is structured. So I understand the last few chapters of Devarim as telling me your choices are your own. You're free to make bad choices. You're not going to like the outcome of those choices. So you might want to think about that before you make the bad choice.
We got one more question. Who has the mic?
Hi. I have two quick questions. Did I understand you to say that we were born with an innate understanding of right and wrong?
Yes.
How do you account for the fact that children have to be taught right and wrong? They instinctively don't think do as to others.
Oh, I believe that's a misunderstanding of children. So here's what I believe is true about children. We can disagree about this or we can talk about it. It is certainly true that kids need to be civilized. Don't confuse the inability to restrain yourself as the same thing as not knowing what the right choice is. Kids at a very early age in a crib make ethically driven decisions. Meaning, if you withhold the rattle equally from both kids will be more or less okay with it. But if one kid gets the rattle more than the other, the deprived kid raises holy hell. Right? There have been a whole series of tests that have showed that even perhaps in utero, at the end of development, the kid is already starting to recognize some voices and not other voices, and is starting to bond in ways with some people and not other people. And in the crib, at a very early age, the children are showing ethical considerations of equity, of generosity, of care. Right? And I believe that if you pay attention to the science, you will discover over the next 10 years, the evidence for that will only increase, because that's what happened over the last 40 years, is that our notion of human mindfulness has extended way, way back chronologically. It has extended way out into people who we used to call vegetative, right? And we now know that many of them are actually listening to what's going on around them. They just can't move to show a response. And so I think there's a difference in that learning how to control your impulses, that requires practice. But that doesn't mean that kids aren't born with an ethical sense. And one other thing, that ethical sense comes to us through evolution, and it is practiced in the context of relationships. So I will share with you an experiment. It's a famous experiment from the 50s. They took monkeys and they raised the baby monkeys without any emotional warmth. Meaning there were rugged, monkey-looking like things that had bottles for food, so they could get all the food they wanted, and there was something they could cling to. They just didn't get hugged ever. These monkeys grew up to be monstrous. They were violent, they were uncontainable, they were hostile to other monkeys, they bit themselves because mammals need love. And if mammals are given love, they will grow towards the light. They will be good. It's in them. All right? I believe that with every fiber of my being. My tradition teaches me that. Right? We have been told what is good and what the Lord wants from us. Right? We ate from the tree of good and evil. That's the Bible's way of saying not our fruit preferences, but to say that since the Garden of Eden, knowledge of good and evil is innate, but it needs to be practiced. And the way you strengthen someone's sense of good and evil is not by beating them when they make bad choices, but by loving them when they make good choices. Last thing I want to say on that subject, we learned this from SeaWorld. My daughter went to SeaWorld camp. The problem at SeaWorld, I mean, now they have a different problem, but 10 years ago, their problem was how do you train an animal big enough that it can eat you? right? You don't want to smack a killer whale on its nose. Don't. You don't roll up a paper and whack it on the face when it doesn't do what you want. So the way you train Shamu is you only reward its good behavior. And when it behaves in a way differently than what you want, you just don't respond at all. That, it turns out, is enough. You can get a killer whale to do almost anything if you just reward it for its goodness. And reward can be a little ice to chew on. Reward can be a nice massage on the nose, right? It's about relationship. So here's what I want to say. We are, all of us, born in the context of relationship. Morality comes in the context of relationship. Goodness is manifest in the context of love and relationship. But isn't that what our whole tradition is about? People forget that Judaism isn't just about commands and a king. Judaism starts with being chosen in love. God literally falls in love with Abraham and Sarah, with Isaac and Rebekah, and with their children's children. And because of that love, God hears our cry and brings us out and gathers us around a mountain and says, let's hang out together and be a people. The mitzvahs are a system of living the love, right? I think that's a better explanation of our faith than the alternatives.
Can I just ask you to clarify the comment?
Wait, stop. Afterward. What's the name of the book on God? Your book?
The name of the book on God, my book, well, the book on God is called the Torah.
Yeah. Which we highly recommend. The one that you wrote.
But if you have to buy one, the book that I wrote is called God of Becoming and Relations.
The God of Becoming and
Relationship. And it's
Jewish Lights.
It's Jewish Lights. If you go to Amazon or wherever you buy books and type in Brad Artson, that's me, you'll find that book. I also have a new book coming out at the end of the month, and it's a book on science and religion called Renewing the Process of Creation. I'm very excited about that book, too.
Good. Thank you, Rabbi Artson.